Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. President. Congress is failing disaster survivors across the country right now. Whether in Lahaina or in Burlington, survivors are not getting the full support of the federal government because Congress has yet to provide funding for long-term disaster recovery needs. And that's in spite of the fact that every passing month, more and more communities are being struck by extreme weather and need help in the rebuilding process. It was more than 4 months ago that President Biden requested $2.8 billion for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, CDBG-DR. CDBG-DR funding is a lifeline for families and businesses who are trying to recover from disasters, helping them to get back on their feet faster and more fully. Yet the spending package that Congress passed 2 weeks ago did not include a dime in new funding for CDBG-DR, despite the efforts of myself and my colleagues, including the presiding officer, on both sides of the aisle from disaster-affected states. Supporting disaster survivors has never been and should never be a partisan issue, nor can it be buried at the bottom of a long list of federal priorities. It is one of our most core responsibilities as the federal government to show up for Americans in their hour of need when the state and local government is overwhelmed. And we have a chance to do that by including CDBG-DR funding in the appropriations package that we'll be voting on later this week. People on Maui and every other disaster-struck community are counting on us for support. And it can't be that the federal government leaves them high and dry midway through the process of putting their lives back together because we couldn't get some numbers to add up. That's unacceptable, and we need to pass this funding now. Mr. President, I ask consent that the following remarks appear in a different part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a place where bipartisanship is harder to find than it is to talk about, there's a glimmer of hope this week. In the appropriations package that passed 2 weeks ago, there was a rare product of quiet, good faith, bipartisan efforts. A record amount of funding for housing for Native communities across the country. Working together, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and the House included $1.3 billion for Native housing as part of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Bill. That's an increase of a little more than $300 million. Tribal communities, as a direct consequence of perennial underfunding and neglect by the federal government, experience some of the highest poverty rates and worst living conditions in the nation. They're 5 times as likely to live in homes without plumbing, 4 times more likely to not have basic appliances such as a sink or a stove or a refrigerator, and 1,200 times likelier to experience issues with heating. 1,200 times likelier to experience issues with heating. So for them, the historic funding is a very, very big deal. It means that they can build more affordable housing, provide rental assistance, and get electricity and plumbing into their homes. The bill also includes a significant increase for funding for tribal transportation, which will help to repair roads on tribal lands that are in dire shape and improve transit across reservation land for people trying to get to work or to school or to the grocery store. This funding builds on the historic investments we've made in tribal transportation infrastructure over the past few years with the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. It's about $175 million new dollars for tribal transportation. All of this funding came to be because colleagues on both sides of the aisle in both chambers said, whatever other differences we may have, we agree that this is important and urgent and worth fighting for. And we got to work and we actually did it. Bipartisan victories do not grab the headlines in this town. They don't lead cable news or get tons of engagement on Twitter because there isn't a villain to ridicule or a controversy to editorialize about. But the federal government has a trust responsibility to American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, which we've long fallen short of. For generations, Native communities were considered an afterthought, especially in the spending process. Today, through steps like these, bit by bit, we're saying no more. And so I want to thank everyone who worked for months quietly behind the scenes to get this done. That includes members and staff of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Housing, as well as the Committee on Indian Affairs, both of which I chair. I especially want to thank my ranking member, Cynthia Hyde-Smith, and my vice chair, Lisa Murkowski, for their continued partnership on this and other Native issues. I want to thank the many committee members who advocated for this funding on behalf of Native communities in their home states. I'm also grateful to our counterparts in the House, Representative Cole, the chairman of the Rules Committee and the chairman of the THUD Subcommittee, and Representative Quigley, who fought to include this funding despite difficult fiscal constraints. And as always, none of this is ever possible without the incredible staff on these committees who patiently and painstakingly turn commitments and deals made at the member level into real dollars and cents enshrined in federal law. Over the past few years as a nation, we've begun to reckon with and address historic injustices against marginalized communities. It's important, it's necessary, and it's long overdue. But somehow a lot of that work has glossed over America's first injustices, the injustice towards Native people. It is a brutal history spanning centuries and generations, forcibly removing Native people from their homelands, pushing children into boarding schools, robbing ancestral remains and cultural items. The impacts of the colonization and forced assimilation are being felt to this day. We're not going to reverse hundreds of years of injustice in one legislative session. But it can't be that remedying those injuries and those injustices and finally doing right by Native people takes another few centuries. It needs to start happening now. And that requires all of us learning and really understanding the long and painful history. It means addressing the many ways that Native culture has been repeatedly robbed and harmed, which is something that the Committee on Indian Affairs, federal agencies, and others are working on with things like the repatriation of cultural remains and language revitalization. And above all, it means supporting the everyday material needs of Native people. They need electricity. They need running water. They need reliable heating in their homes. They need safe roads and accessible transit. All of this work has to happen together. The good news is this: here in Congress, people in both parties recognize the urgency of issues affecting Native communities and are committed to prioritizing them. And even if that doesn't make for a splashy headline, it's no small thing for the millions of Native people across the country who are depending on us. Thank you. I yield the floor.